Okay, so Annie Besant once said, occultism is the most orderly thing in the world. And what she meant is that once you discover the logic behind the area that you're studying, all the pieces begin to fit into place. That comes from a small pamphlet called The Ruler and the Teacher. And I'm going to use that as a basis for talking to you about why I think there are 3 paths instead of 2. So if you look at this chart, you'll see a core, basic core of what I'll be talking about in a moment. So in the theosophical notion of how the universe was created or emanated, it goes through several phases. These phases are labeled logoi, that's plural for logos. Logos is a word from Neoplatonism, and it means essentially an aspect of God consciousness. So we have 3 aspects of God consciousness over the top. The way the emanation takes place is it begins with the first logos. The first logos is the absolute. It's beyond our comprehension. As it considers the possibility of growth, it begins to polarize itself into something almost like an egg, containing the opposites that make up the universe. One version of that is self and not self. And then that breaks apart, and in the process of that breaking apart, the lower realms are all formed, and that becomes the field of evolution. So in the theosophical teaching about 7 rays, there are 3 primary rays. Each of these rays is an emanation of this God consciousness. And the ray that's involved with the first logos, or the absolute, is called the ray of will and power. The one for the second logos is called the ray of love and wisdom. And the ray of the third logos is called the ray of creation and activity. So it's easy to understand that will and power would be attributes of the absolute. And then that love and wisdom would somehow be an expansion of that into a realm of beings, other beings. That's the point where all the souls or monads are created, and then these are assigned the task of evolving back to oneness with the source. And then the field of activity where all this happens is the third logos. Each of these 3 manifestations of God consciousness comes with a particular attribute. Omnipotence, which is all power. Omnipresence, which means being present everywhere. And omniscience, which is knowing everything. And in the idea that Blavatsky taught about the 7 principles, the first logos in human consciousness is expressed through the spirit or the will or Atman, the Sanskrit word for highest self. And the second logos is expressed through the heart or buddhi, which is that principle of unity consciousness that I spoke about earlier. And then the third principle is expressed through mind, or manas. And we can see how will and power and omnipotence, or all power, and spirit are all connected in Atman. And we have this will and power within ourselves as one of our principles of consciousness. We can also see how love, wisdom would be an all-pervading presence and connected to the heart and unity consciousness. And we can see how the notion of creation and activity would be involved with omniscience, knowing everything, as an expression of mind. And usually, these are considered to be hierarchical in the sense that spirit came first, generated heart or buddhi, and then those generated mind. So It's important to understand this very brief summary of some of the basic, underlying aspects of our universe of evolution. So I wonder if there are any questions before I go on. Okay. So it's very important that I let everyone know that this chart is based on things that you will find in the Secret Doctrine, by Blavatsky in the Ancient Wisdom, by Besant in Esoteric Christianity and a Study in Consciousness by Annie Besant. Those three books by Annie Besant are all attempts on her part to systematize what is taught in the Secret Doctrine. It's important for me, I call this showing you my math homework, because you know when you're studying math as a young student, the teacher wants to make sure not simply that you get the right answer, but that you also took the right steps to get the right answer. And I want to make sure that the particular way that I'm extending some theosophical principles is rooted in our fundamental teachings, so that I'm not accused of neo-theosophy, which was something that Annie Besant was often accused of. I don't know why it's an evil word, but some people thought so. Okay, so I'm making what I would call a modest proposal. In other words, I'm not demanding that people believe in the way that I'm putting out here. I'm simply introducing the idea for your consideration. The theosophical paths, as talked about, pretty much talk about a mystic path, which would be the expression of Buddhi, and an occultist path, which would be an expression of Manas. The third path, the one that would correspond to Atman, is not present. But it seems that the dark magician expressing will is actually a form of Atman, whereas the white magician is a form of Buddhi. So in a sense, all three of those basic principles are covered. But what I think is that the mystic and the Atman should go together. And what I call the empath, the being that is able, the individual human consciousness that's able to feel itself as one with other beings, is the expression of Buddhi. And the seer, the clairvoyant, and it's a form of the occultist, is an expression of Manas. And I hope, as I continue to talk, you'll see why this somewhat changed expression could be useful. So what are the three paths? In order to talk about this, I have to introduce you to the idea of three basic psychic types or temperaments. This was something I noticed in my classes. I've taught classes on psychic and spiritual development for nearly 25 years. And I noticed that for some students, the way I taught was very easy, and that for others, there was a big struggle. And there were two kinds of struggles. One of them is, oh, I'm not doing this right. And the other one was, you were wrong. So what I learned from this was that there actually are three different types, and that I was teaching the way a seer would teach using guided imagery, but that the students who were protesting were either mystics or empaths, and then I tried to expand my ability to teach all three types. So Theosophy was a great help for this, but also the need in order to understand my students became a great impetus to explore some theosophical principles and take them farther. So I believe that we have inner senses, that these inner senses are capable of bringing to us data or information from non-physical realms of being, or from the non-physical aspects of our physical life. For example, telepathy would be a non-physical aspect of physical life. And that these three that inner sense data can be perceived in 3 different ways. It's possible to perceive it only in one of the 3 ways, or in a combination of 2 of the 3 ways, or in a combination of all 3. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So I call these 3 ways energy, consciousness, and information. And as you'll see, each of these has a corresponding expression. The individuals who perceive energy are, in a sense, perceiving the truth of our reality, because even our physical reality is all made up of energy, and this is even more true of the non-physical reality, where we don't have things, we have other kinds of manifestations of energy. People who perceive through the inner sense data through consciousness are always interested in a relationship between beings. So, for example, in the time of the spiritualists, there was a strong desire to be put in touch with your deceased loved ones, and the desire to have that experience, to remain in contact with them. And the mediums who were able to do that were able to do that through the consciousness aspect of inner sense data. And then finally, people like me, dealing with imagery, very busy dream life, and astral projection experiences taking me into other realms that seem like worlds to me, with beings and dwellings and habitations and so on. This happens to be the way I perceive through my inner senses. And I believe that those who are responsive to energy and truth are the mystics. Those who are responsive to consciousness and relationship are the empaths. And those who respond to information and imagery are the seers. But it also seems that there are connections where people who have developed their inner sensibilities start to experience a combination. So it becomes possible to talk about a mystic who has an empathic side, or an empath with a mystical side. Similarly, a mystic with a seer side, or a seer with a mystical side, or empath seers, or seer empaths. If you want to explore these ideas a little more deeply, there's a Do You Know Your Psychic Type program on the YouTube channel for the Theosophical Society in America. They may have taken it off. They were trying to monetize things and they moved it to another platform, but it didn't really work, and I hope they've moved it back. But there is also this sweet spot in the middle where all 3 of the types come together. My belief is that we all start with one. And if we get some training through meditation or psychic or spiritual development, we add in a 2nd type. And then if we, in a sense, master our inner sensibilities, we have all 3 types functioning. And what this means in practical terms is that people with only one of them are not very reliable in terms of their insights into the universe. So a mystic who's only a mystic doesn't have the ability to relate to other beings and doesn't see things in imagery, and couldn't communicate with you in any other way than simply by transmitting their energy to you and hoping that you are also a mystic and that you'll get it. I've met people like this. I've had them in my classes. They don't want to hear about bodies and planes. They only want to transcend everything and go to oneness with God. And I have learned a lot of patience talking to them. Of course, mystics are in touch with the truth, so patience doesn't do much good. I will say some things that sound critical of the different types. This is somewhat intended as a humorous thing, because really I've learned a deep level of tolerance for all of them. But it also happens that the only way to identify when you're talking to someone who isn't your type is about what you don't like about them. And so it's good to pay attention to these things. On the other hand, the empaths are so deeply involved in consciousness and beings that they also are not interested in the truth of God consciousness beyond that, or in the bodies and planes. And so if you ever hear someone say, oh, those New Age types, all they do is hug trees, that person is responding to someone who was an empath. And every type always believes it's the only one and everyone else is wrong. And it's an interesting question of universal brotherhood to include these three types in your awareness. The Theosophical Society is very friendly to mystics, but the mystics are not very friendly to seers and empaths. And the empaths and seers often stay away. I've been trying to change that by showing up and talking about my seer way of seeing things, and it's been catching on a bit. Nothing wrong with going directly to God. Like I said earlier, I'm going to smell the roses along the way. Okay, so let's go into some more detail. I want to help you understand the three types better, and so this chart will keep adding levels, and the levels are intended to deepen your understanding. Remember, you're going to get PDFs of all of this material so that you can study it on your own. When this slide is done, if you want to take a picture of it, you're welcome to, because for some people that's one way of taking in the information. So, we talked about the rays in the first of these charts, and the three rays, will and power, love and wisdom, and creation and activity, are the essential ones. And I'm calling each of the ways that people deal with inner sense data a path. So there's a path of the mystic that goes along with the will power ray, a path of the empath, which goes along with the love wisdom ray, and a path of the seer that goes along with the creation activity way. And part of this path is to absorb the other ways of viewing things, because you cannot have complete perception of the universe without, to some extent, dealing with all three forms of inner sense. But as a path back to source, each of these types specializes in something that is needed by source. And so, in a sense, your basic or root type is something that probably never changes from the moment you're projected out of source through all of your lifetimes, and then when you come back to source. That is it could be called the absolute core of your identity. There is a principle like this in Theosophy. I don't know if it was part of the esoteric school teachings or whether it was an invention of Alice Bailey, but she spoke about something called a monadic ray. Now, in the Theosophical teachings, the highest level of being is the Logos level, the God consciousness level. One level below that is the monadic level. And this monad is the indivisible self that we are. You could say it's the higher self or the highest self. It's beyond our soul. And it is the part of us that evolves, gathers information, develops itself fully, and then comes back to God consciousness essentially as a God in itself. And each of these types will be the kind of God that we become. So again, there's a basis in what I'm talking about here, although it's not something that you will see unless you've read very deeply in the Theosophical literature. So on each path, there's a task of something to develop. Individuals on the mystic path develop identity in the sense of true identity, true function within God consciousness. But it also means that to develop identity, they may not be aware of union, and this is the basis of the selfishness that we saw and the dark magicians earlier. Not to say that all mystics are or were dark magicians, but that's one way that the mystical path develops. So on the empath, the idea is union, unity, consciousness, universal brotherhood. On the seer path, it's integration. So remember that I said earlier, there's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So in a sense, the mystics are one side, the empaths are the opposite side, and the seers represent the balance in the middle. Each of these, as I expressed earlier, has its own particular sense: energy for mystics, consciousness for empaths, information for seers. And each has a particular way of perceiving things, or a particular thing that's perceived. Truth for the mystics, relationship with the empaths, imagery or information as imagery for the seers. Each of them has a particular goal that they're seeking. For the mystics, it's transcendence of the laws and powers of the universe. For the empaths, it's unity with all other beings. For the seers, it's the discovery of all the different parts and systems of the universe, the bodies, the planes, the things I'm always interested in. Each one of them is seeking to master something. With the mystics, they're trying to master the powers and laws of the universe. With the empaths, it's mastering the relationship between beings and their needs. And with the seers, it's mastering the way the systems and the parts of the universe fit together. Each one of them is seeking to overcome something. With the mystics, it's overcoming illusion. Everything that we perceive as physical being a mask or an illusion that conceals the God consciousness within it. They want to strip away that illusion and become one with the God consciousness. For those on the empath, they're trying to overcome the separation that we experience by being individual consciousness units in a body. Essentially, this unity consciousness develops from an attempt to overcome the feeling that we all have of loneliness or separateness. And the seers are seeking to overcome ignorance of all of the different aspects of God consciousness as expressed in places and planes and bodies. Each one of them is trying to actualize one of the aspects of God within themselves. As I already spoke about, for the mystic it's spirit or Atma. For the empath it's heart or buddhi. For the seer it's mind or manas. Each one is attempting to achieve a particular thing. Liberation from all barriers and boundaries for the mystic. Permeation of all other beings. Oneness with all other beings for the empath. Illumination or illuminated understanding for the seers. And each one has a particular function that they perform in this process of becoming. For the mystic, they become teachers of the difference between the real and the unreal, illusion and reality. The empaths become healers, healers of all forms of separation. The seers become guides. They help individuals, for example, in the afterlife, move from one point to another by guiding them. And finally, each of the three aspects of God consciousness is embodied within someone who has achieved mastery of any of these paths. Omnipotence, which is all power, omnipresence, which is all embracing presence, and omniscience, which is all knowledge. So I talk about in the afternoon the three ladders that we can use as a way of pursuing our journey back to Source. And essentially this is the map that I've developed to try to talk about those different steps and stages and goals and so on. I know you all have questions, and there'll be plenty of time for these in the afternoon. So I'll just continue with the presentation now, with a reminder that you'll have an opportunity through the PDFs to study this and think about it and see if it fits for you. So what do these paths actually mean? If I talk about the path of the mystic, rephrasing what I put in that chart, I would say it is to overcome illusion, to transcend the laws and the powers of the universe, to actualize the self as will, as Atman, as omnipotence, and to become a teacher of liberation from karmic law. In other words, freedom from karmic law. I think it's better to think about liberation in terms of freedom from karmic law than freedom from ever having to reincarnate. As I mentioned in an earlier segment of the program, I think the idea of liberation, meaning getting off the planet and never coming back, is somewhat limited, because we come back as individuals who serve the masters and the process of evolution. So, this is the ray of will and power. At the end of this ray, the forceful or the wrathful deity teachers, individuals who become the keepers of karmic law. And I wonder whether in the Mahatma letters, Master Morya, and with his particular personality of confronting illusion, is an expression of this path of the mystic at a high level of realization. So now, what is the path of the empath? To overcome separation, master the relations between beings and needs in every realm of the universe, to actualize the self as oneness or buddhi, and to become a healer to each and all. This is the ray of love, wisdom, or omnipresence. It's the ray where the compassionate deity teachers would come into play. And again, I wonder from the Mahatma letters whether Master Kutumi, who is so compassionate and understanding, may be an expression of this path of the empath. And then the path of the seer, to overcome ignorance, discover the systems and parts of the universe, actualize the self as knower, or manas, and to become a guide to all beings and realms. This is the ray of creation, activity, or omniscience, and it involves a term that doesn't appear in Tibetan Buddhism. I've borrowed it from ancient Egyptian mythology. There is a god called Wep-Oret, who is a god of death. Looks a little bit like Anubis, who's the more familiar god of death. Anubis is a human body with the head of a jackal, whereas Wep-Oret is a human body with the head of a dog. And Wep-Oret means opener of the way. And so I understand that the function of the seer as an opener of the way is to show the way from one realm to another. And it's possible that the masters Paul the Venetian, Serapis, Hilarion, Jesus, and Saint Germain, in other words, the masters of the third through the seventh rays, would be openers of the way with various cultural specialties. Probably most especially Saint Germain from the Theosophical Society. So another way to understand these different paths is to investigate what could be called dysfunction on these paths. What happens if you are pursuing these paths without some degree of understanding of the others? If you've got identity without union, you've got an utterly selfish, black or dark magician. Somebody who's only trying to get power over others. There's no empathy, there's a ruthlessness, and there's an exploitativeness. They can be overbearing, consumed by ambition. So this essentially is a description of the bad guy in every film ever made, and including those like Star Wars that deal with larger universal realms or mythology. I think it also is an accurate description. If you've got union without identity, you've got an utterly selfless, white light magician. Sounds like a good thing, right? They have no boundaries, and they are often ruthlessly exploited. And they're often overwhelmed and consumed by the world's suffering, even to the point of being unable, almost paralyzed, to do anything about it. So even if you're on one of these paths, you still have to learn something about the others to come into a proper balance and not be dysfunctional. With integration, you can have it overbalanced in the direction of identity, and then you've got what could be called a minor or a junior black or dark magician. They can be overbearing, yet capable of guilt and remorse, and often redeemed by an increase within themselves of union and love. But integration can also be tipped toward union if you're a seer. You can be a minor or junior white light magician, overwhelmed yet capable of resentment or revenge, and redeemed by increased identity and will. I can speak more clearly about this path because I think I know it in myself. What happens is I come back in a lifetime wanting so much to be of service, and then I'm treated like a doormat. And then, because I hate that and resent that, I come back as an angry, minor dark magician in the next lifetime. And then I get extremely guilty because of all the people that I've abused. And then I start the cycle all over again. And it swings back and forth from one extreme to the other until eventually it comes to rest in the middle. And then there's some peace. Mystics and empaths often can't perceive their extremes. This is something I've noticed. If you're a mystic, that's the only reality. If you're an empath, in a sense, same thing. And if you're overly selfish, you don't see it as a mystic. If you're overly unselfish to the point of paralysis, you don't see it as an empath. And as I mentioned, until integrated, seers experience a kind of identity crisis over whether they're dark or light magicians, switching polarities from one lifetime to the next. They move from exploited light magician or resentment to exploitive dark magician, and then experience guilt and go back and forth. But integrated seers can show mystics how to tone down their selfish ambition and develop empathy, if they're willing to listen. Integrated seers can show empaths how to tone down their selfless overwhelm and develop boundaries. These are the things I try to do in my classes. In a sense, all three types are absolutely essential because the pure identity type shows the way to develop identity, the pure union type shows the way to develop union, and the integrated type helps all three ways learn how to create balance. So what would happen if we changed around some theosophical terminology in conjunction with what I've been talking about here? The old terms, mystic, would become the new terms empath or soul healer. Now, this is the old way mystic is talked about in the theosophical literature. It's much more associated with empathy than it is with the dark magic that I've been talking about. The old term occultist would be associated with the seer or soul guide. And the third type that doesn't really exist in the old terminology would be the mystic or soul teacher. The path of the mystic in the old way would be the path of the empath or the union path. The path of the occultist in the old way would be the path of the seer or integration path. And the unnamed third path would be the path of the mystic or identity path. This requires a bit of revision in our understanding of what a mystic is, because there are many people who I would call empaths who consider themselves mystics. And I think it's probably better for them to think of themselves as mystics in the sense of being saints, because what they're doing is they're embracing all in oneness. instead of going absolute up to God. Both, of course, are completely valid paths. It's just that the word mystic has a kind of glamour about it, and people love to use the word, and I'm trying to refine the understanding a little bit, and some people have pushed back against that. The old terms, black or dark magic or magician, would be changed to destructive or selfish magic or magician. And the old term of white or light magic or magician would be changed to constructive or selfless magic or magician. The black or dark magic path would be changed to identity path. The white, light, or magic path would be changed to union path. And the great white lodge or brotherhood would be called the occult hierarchy. So we get rid of the whiteness, which has been abused by white supremacists. And then we would delete some old terms, brothers of the shadow, brothers of the light, lords of the dark face, and so on, as no longer being helpful or relevant. Remember, the purpose of this talk is to move from theosophy then to theosophy now, as I envision it. So this is the bridge. Now I want to complete this talk with a little bit about what happens when you develop yourself fully. So if you're a fully developed empath as a soul healer, this is what you essentially become or embody in the world. And I've said it as a kind of mantra. As I say these mantras, you might find that you respond to one more than another, and that can be a guide to which path you're on. I am Buddhi, the seed of wisdom in all beings, the gentle, supportive, supremely loving embrace that heals their separateness, realizes their oneness, and softly, sweetly draws them home, obviously home to source. As long as the universe exists, I am bound to nurture the learning and growth of its every particle, from isolated identity to all-inclusive unity, and boundless bliss in the omnipresent divine. Similarly, with the soul, there might be a soul guide, the seer, there might be a mantra like this. I am Manas, the seed of self-knowledge in all beings, self meaning higher self, the ever-increasing understanding that lights their way through bodies, levels, states, and realms, and firmly yet gently guides them home to their true purpose and place. As long as the universe exists, I am bound to illuminate the learning and growth of its every particle. From deepest ignorance of self as matter to highest awareness of oneself as spirit, within the omniscient divine. And it looks like we're missing a slide. The identity path is missing. All right. I'll have to add that in because it's on a different memory state when we talk this afternoon. I guess that's a cliffhanger, isn't it? Well, the way I want to end this talk is to show that Annie Besant's universal invocation, which we use to begin our program, is actually, in a sense, keyed into what I've been talking about here. O hidden light, vibrant in every atom. This is the manas, the seer, the information, the systems, the parts, as indicated by the word life, words life and atom. O hidden light, shining in every creature. That's Atman, the mystic, the energy, the light, shining in all beings, the laws and the powers of the universe. O hidden love, embracing all in oneness. Buddhi, the empath, having to do with consciousness, beings, and needs. May all who feel themselves as one with thee know they are therefore one with every other. So when we say this prayer, we're really essentially inviting all three of the types to show up and to be present with each other in the sense of oneness. Just as we were talking about earlier with that sweet spot in the middle. And this is a beautiful rendition of the path by a theosophical artist named Reginald Miquel. And I love it because it really has so many different teachings contained in it, from the individuals who are essentially not yet on the path, to someone who's climbing the path, to the teachers that they're moving toward on the path, to the occult hierarchy that supports them in that development, all contained within the universe and embraced by a master or an angel, or however you want to consider that, being at the top. Well, I apologize for the missing identity path. We'll do that as the basis or the beginning of our afternoon session. Did people notice when I was reading those mantras that the energy of the room changed in some way? It felt big somehow. That might happen again this afternoon. Maybe it's just that when I say the seer one, I feel like I'm calling out to myself and recognizing myself. So let's have some questions before we break for lunch.
What was the first one?
Okay. You said about the seer to help the soul after life. So you mean that the seer can transplant himself or see after life if the soul is going to the right path or something like that? So a seer has the capacity to this realm, this world, and the other world also?
Yes, this is true. So my book, Otherwhere, which is in the bookshop, is a book that was written before I became a Theosophist, although it's now in a revised version with some notes that help line it up with some of the theosophical teachings. It's essentially the story of how my astral projection experiences developed, and primarily I was exploring the afterlife and learning about how different souls were living, learning, and growing within. At that time, I was doing it primarily as an observer. Sometimes now, 30 years after those experiences, I'm actively involved in helping. Perhaps tonight when we do our storytelling, I'll tell the story of how I helped my father make his transition, which happened a couple of years ago. But there is, I can't say that I have a constant awareness of the physical and the astral realms all the time, but when I'm sleeping, I often do some traveling there and some helping people find their way.
The artist, how can, I think it's category 3, is that right? The artist, novelist, or painters, there must be seers too, in a way.
Yes, often.
Creative work.
The fourth ray is specifically the one that's involved with that kind of creativity. So the way it's taught in some theosophical literature is that there are 3 primary rays, which are the ones I've been talking about, and the third ray splits into 5. And those 5 rays are involved with human culture in various ways. So there's the ray of harmony, which is the third ray, that has to do essentially with diplomacy. ray of the arts, which is the fourth ray, a ray of science, which is the fifth, a ray of devotion, spiritual devotion, which is as the basis of religion, is the sixth, and then a ray of ceremonial work and ritual and working with devas and nature spirits. So all of those rays come under the heading of the monadic ray of activity as expressions of the universe, active expressions of the universe. And in a sense, the seers would be involved with all of them. But the thing is, anybody on any path can use any vehicle for expressing themselves in the world. It's not limited in that way. And in some teachings on rays, you've got a monadic ray, which is your path back to source. But you also have a soul ray, which determines the nature of your incarnational cycle, at least as a human being. And then a personality ray, which could be quite different. Alice Bailey goes into a lot of information about these things as a way of helping people understand their type and their path. I haven't looked too deeply into all of that. I'm just aware of it as a system. And I think in our evolution back to oneness with Source, from our individual perspective, we experience pretty much every aspect of what it means at every level to be whatever kind of being we are at that level. Whether it's an atom or a mineral or a plant or an animal or a human being. So, another question?
Thank you.
Yeah, you're too close to the loudspeaker on the wall. That's just important.
Can you tell what you call astral projection?
Yes. So, astral projection is the ability for consciousness or conscious awareness to leave the physical body and travel. And the word astral in Theosophy is often specifically applied to the plane just beyond the physical plane, the first of the non-physical planes, which is considered to be the realm of dreams that we experience every night, as well as the first set of realms that people experience once they have died. However, the older meaning of astral, especially the way it was used in Blavatsky's writings, refers to any non-physical reality or realm. So astral projection is the ability to project one's consciousness out of the physical body into some non-physical realm. The word astral comes from the Latin astra, which means star. And so the idea is starry realms or the universe, space, things like that. It's not a happy word for a lot of people because it covers too much, but it's a convenient word. Out-of-body experience is a more recent development, more seemingly scientific, but that tends to refer only to the experience of consciousness being in the same room as the physical body, but not being identified with the physical body, and less having to do with travel. And then there's something called remote viewing, where your consciousness travels to a faraway place and in the physical world and sees something there and comes back and then discovers perhaps that what was seen was true. There are many different applications of the idea of astral projection. There's a lot of teaching in Theosophy about how we have different non-physical bodies, and in this physical body we have one kind of experience, but slightly away from the physical body is a layer called the etheric body, the body of vitality, and then slightly farther out is a layer representing the astral level of being, and then the mental level, and the causal level, and then quite far out, the Buddhic level. Each of these layers of the aura is said to be a body, or a vehicle of consciousness, something that awareness can travel in. And each of these bodies is tied to a realm of non-physical reality called a plane that you visit when you're in that body. So that's a very short answer to a fairly complex question. Anyone else?
When you travel when you do astral travel, sometimes people don't notice you. And what if somebody suddenly looks out and notices you? Is it possible? Because, then you feel bad, I think, because it is like if you did break something in their realm, you know? Because they have the right, you don't have the right to break in their realm, but it is like they notice you. What can you say about that? What can you do about that?
So, it's not an invasion. My experience is, if you're traveling, excuse me, in a higher body than the realm that you're visiting, so for example, if I was in my mental body visiting the astral realm, I have a perception of what's going on in the astral realm where I won't be seen. I could only be seen on that realm by beings who were in that same body, on that realm or on the mental realm. It's important that the beings who are working through whatever they're doing on the astral level have no interference from outside in their process. But there are teachers and healers that will work with them, and they may be more or less aware of them. But there's never an invasion. You can always create a complete block to that sort of thing. And many of us carry with us into the afterlife that kind of block because we've been so separated. So, for example, I had a person who lived below me. I had lived in an apartment building with 3 levels. This woman lived on the 2nd level. This was about 15 years ago. I was traveling in Europe. When I came back, I learned that she had committed suicide, sad to say. I knew her for about 10 years, not very well. So she was someone who was very isolated in herself and suffering very much from that. And one time I was traveling and I ended up, without intention, coming to the door of the space that she was inhabiting in the non-physical, in the astral level. It was like a 1-room apartment, very small. And she looked up and she saw me standing at the door. And she recognized me and didn't in any way feel that I was invading. She said, oh, so you really are a psychic? And I said, yes. And she said, well, you didn't look like one. And I said, well, what does that mean? What did you expect? And she said, oh, you know, purple hair and your head spins around 360 degrees. She had a funny sense of humor. And then she said to me, come here a minute, sit down on this couch. I have this incredible television set. I want you to see it. So here was the television set, and she said, this is the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. I get to look at all of my friends, and I get to see all the awful things that are about to happen to them before they happen. And I get to see the look on their face when it happens. It's the funniest thing. Well, she was not a very evolved soul, obviously.
So are you getting out of herself too?
Yes, but I mean, it wasn't an invasion. It was, in a sense, it was constructive. At least I learned something from it. I have lots of stories like that. And I hope we'll create a space where people can share their stories about their own inner experiences. Anything else before we head off to lunch? Okay, let's say this morning session is complete.